In January 532 CE, the heavy bronze gates of the Hippodrome in Constantinople were barred from the outside, sealing 30,000 Roman citizens within the massive arena. They were largely unarmed, trapped not by a foreign army breaching the frontier, but by the elite, battle-hardened regular troops of their own imperial government. As General Belisarius ordered his veterans forward with drawn swords, the empire's greatest stadium was instantly converted into an inescapable execution ground. The man who orchestrated this annihilation was not a conquering enemy. It was their own sovereign, Emperor Justinian. Intended by law and tradition to be the supreme protector of the populace, he instead chose to massacre his own subjects to secure his grip on power. This was the climax of the Nika Riots. It remains the deadliest urban insurrection and subsequent civilian slaughter in European history, presenting a brutal historical paradox where a ruler deliberately eradicated a massive segment of his capital city to reassert absolute autocratic control over the Senate and the streets. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the Nika Riots. We will analyze the crushing tax policies that ignited the population, the political trap leveraged by opportunistic factions, and the cold tactical execution that saved a dynasty while destroying a generation. But to understand why an emperor would authorize the extermination of 30,000 of his own people in a single afternoon, we first have to examine the administrative machinery of the state and the deep resentment building in the shadows of Constantinople just days before the slaughter began. Emperor Justinian ascended to the throne with an ambition that vastly outstripped the financial reserves of the state. He envisioned a fully revived Roman Empire, planning massive military campaigns to reconquer the lost western provinces from Germanic tribes and simultaneously commissioning monumental architectural projects to project his divine authority. To manifest this grand strategic vision, the imperial administration required an unprecedented, continuous influx of capital. The burden of funding these imperial dreams fell squarely onto the shoulders of the populace, restructuring the economy of the empire from the poorest urban laborers in Constantinople to the wealthiest senatorial landowners in the provinces. To extract this wealth, Justinian bypassed the traditional aristocracy, elevating administrators who prioritized ruthless efficiency over custom. Chief among them was the Praetorian prefect, John the Cappadocian. Tasked with overhauling the imperial tax system, John unleashed a fiscal regime of terrifying scope and profound brutality. He relentlessly audited the accounts of the wealthy, eliminated bureaucratic redundancies, and imposed heavy new levies on the urban populations. The prefect's agents frequently utilized imprisonment and physical torture to uncover hidden assets and force rapid compliance, treating Roman citizens with a severity usually reserved for foreign captives. The heavy rhythmic clinking of the tax collector's scales became the defining sound of Justinian's domestic policy, a constant reminder that private property was entirely subordinate to the needs of the imperial treasury. While John the Cappadocian systematically drained the physical wealth of the empire, the quaestor Tribonian monopolized its justice system. Tasked by the emperor with revising and codifying centuries of complex Roman law, Tribonian possessed an immense legal intellect, but he operated his immediate courts with notorious corruption. Under his administration, imperial decrees, judgments, and legal interpretations were frequently altered or directly sold to the highest bidder. For the citizens of Constantinople, the law was no longer an impartial shield against the overreach of the state. It was merely another transactional mechanism of financial extraction. This dual assault on civil wealth and legal justice achieved a social phenomenon that was historically rare. It unified the deeply fractured classes of the capital against the throne. The plebeians were crushed by indirect taxes, struggling against the rising cost of basic survival in a densely packed metropolis. Simultaneously, the ancient senatorial aristocracy found themselves deliberately sidelined from political power and systematically targeted by John's aggressive audits. The Senate, once the guiding deliberative body of the Roman state, was reduced to a state of alienated, simmering silence. They watched their ancestral prestige ignored by the emperor's ruthless, newly elevated bureaucrats, possessing the wealth and influence to plot regime change, but lacking a direct avenue to challenge the autocrat. By the freezing weeks of January 532 CE, the fundamental social contract between the ruler and the ruled had been entirely severed. The urban masses were impoverished, the elite were heavily alienated, and the administrative machinery of the government was universally despised. The entire capital was a powder keg, soaking in resentment. To understand how this impoverished and fractured populace could mount a synchronized assault on the most heavily fortified palace in Europe, one must examine the institutional power of the Demes. Often misunderstood by modern observers as mere sporting associations or chariot racing fan clubs, the Blues and the Greens were, in reality, highly organized political syndicates with formidable paramilitary wings. In a sprawling capital of 500,000 citizens, these factions filled the void left by a distant central government. They functioned as neighborhood watch organizations, emergency fire brigades, and vast patronage networks. Their leaders wielded immense influence, capable of mobilizing thousands of armed young men from the city's lower classes at a moment's notice. The physical center of their leverage was the Hippodrome. This monumental arena, capable of seating up to 100,000 spectators, was not simply a venue for entertainment. It served as the sole remaining constitutional space where the masses could interact directly with the emperor. While the traditional Senate had been marginalized, the Demes weaponized the architecture of the stadium. They used the overwhelming rhythmic chanting of their members to broadcast political demands, condemn corrupt administrators, or petition for legal clemency. Seated high above the track in his fortified imperial box, the Kathisma, Justinian was forced to listen. This dynamic transformed every chariot race into a high-stakes political negotiation. Historically, the imperial court maintained control by playing the factions against one another. Emperor Justinian himself had spent years actively patronizing the Blues, using their street gangs to intimidate political rivals and violently suppress the Greens. This explicit favoritism had granted the Blues near-total impunity, allowing them to carry weapons, extort merchants, and commit political assassinations without fear of the magistrate's justice. However, by the winter of 532 CE, Justinian required absolute domestic order to secure the home front before launching his massive military reconquest of the West. He abruptly severed his ties with the Blues and ordered the newly appointed city prefect Eudaemon to institute a brutal crackdown on all urban violence, prosecuting both factions with indiscriminate severity. This sudden withdrawal of imperial protection was a fatal administrative miscalculation. Justinian assumed the heavy-handed arrests would force the gangs into submission. Instead, his magistrates proved that neither faction could rely on the emperor's favor. Stripped of their political immunity and facing execution by the state, the militant leaders of both the Blues and the Greens realized that their mutual hatred was secondary to their mutual survival. By attempting to pacify the capital through sheer autocratic force, the emperor had inadvertently unified the city's two largest private armies. For centuries, the Blues and the Greens had spilled each other's blood in the streets, but no one anticipated what would happen when they decided to point their daggers in the exact same direction. The immediate catalyst arrived on January 10th, 532 CE, across the Golden Horn in the district of Sikai. Eudaemon, the city prefect, had ordered the execution of several ringleaders from a recent street brawl, making no distinction between the factions. Among the condemned were a prominent member of the Blues and a recognized leader of the Greens. The executions were intended to project the absolute, unyielding authority of the imperial administration. However, as the hangman commenced the proceedings, the wooden scaffolding suddenly fractured under the weight. The structure collapsed, sending the men plummeting to the ground still alive. To the deeply religious populace of Constantinople, this mechanical failure was not viewed as an engineering flaw. It was immediately interpreted as a divine judgment. The crowd surrounding the gallows surged forward, shielding the 2 surviving men, one blue and one green, and smuggled them across the water to the sanctuary of the Church of St. Lawrence. Instead of recognizing the volatility of the situation, the imperial government responded with bureaucratic rigidity. Justinian's magistrates immediately deployed an armed guard to surround the church, trapping the men inside but hesitating to directly violate the sacred sanctuary. For 3 days, the tension in the capital mounted. The Demes, realizing that the state intended to starve the men out or drag them to a second execution, found their mutual cause. They sent petitions to the Great Palace, requesting clemency for the 2 survivors. Justinian, cloistered within his administrative bubble and unwilling to display weakness before his planned military campaigns in the West, met every petition with absolute silence. This refusal to negotiate set the stage for the traditional venue of public discourse, the chariot races scheduled for the Ides of January. On January 13th, 532 CE, Emperor Justinian took his seat in the Kathisma overlooking the Hippodrome. Below him, the massive arena was packed with tens of thousands of citizens, neatly divided into the traditional blocks of blue and green supporters. Usually, the early races were accompanied by a fierce exchange of rival insults and factional cheers. On this day, however, the atmosphere was rigidly focused on the emperor. Between the chariot heats, the leaders of both Demes directed their vast blocks of supporters to chant synchronized appeals for mercy toward the imperial box. Race after race, the pleas echoed across the track, demanding pardons for the men trapped in St. Lawrence. Justinian remained immovable, refusing to acknowledge the crowd, his stoic silence signaling a complete dismissal of their political relevance. By the 22nd race, the psychological dynamic of the entire stadium fractured and realigned. Realizing that the emperor would grant no clemency, the disparate voices of the blues and the greens ceased their individual appeals. The long-standing hatred between the factions dissolved in the face of imperial contempt. For the first time in the history of the capital, the leaders of both Demes issued a unified command. The tens of thousands of citizens stopped directing their aggression at each other and turned entirely toward the Kathisma. A single, rhythmic word began to roll through the massive stone structure, a traditional cheer normally reserved for victorious charioteers. Nika, conquer. The unified roar of 100,000 voices physically vibrated through the marble seating, signaling the absolute collapse of Justinian's domestic authority. As the chant echoed against the marble walls, the sporting event ended and an urban war began. The stadium rapidly emptied, and the crowd surged into the adjacent streets as a singular, destructive force. Their first target was not the emperor himself, but the immediate physical symbols of his oppressive administration. The mob descended upon the praetorium, the headquarters of the city prefect, and set it ablaze. The fire quickly spiraled out of control, spreading to the monumental baths of Zeuxippus and consuming the porticos of the Augustine. This was no longer a disorganized riot. It was a systematic dismantling of the state's infrastructure. The spreading inferno ceased to be mere collateral damage. It became a tactical reality, creating a blinding wall of heat and ash that effectively trapped Emperor Justinian and his immediate court within the fortified complex of the Great Palace. Recognizing the imminent collapse of his capital, Justinian attempted a desperate political concession. From behind the palace walls, he issued an imperial decree yielding to the crowd's initial demands. He formally dismissed the architects of his hated policies, the Praetorian prefect John the Cappadocian and the Quaestor Tribonian. A few weeks prior, this absolute surrender of executive power would have been celebrated as a massive triumph for the populace, but the timing was fatally late. The masses, having already felt the intoxicating surge of unchallenged power in the streets, were no longer interested in administrative reform. As the flames jumped to the wooden roof of the original Hagia Sophia, reducing the empire's premier church to smoldering ruins, it became clear that the objective was no longer changing the emperor's advisors. The objective was changing the emperor. This structural vacuum of power immediately drew in the empire's sidelined aristocracy. The ancient senatorial families, who had spent years humiliated by Justinian's autocratic overreach and financially bled by his tax collectors, recognized a singular opportunity for regime change. Rather than retreating to their estates, opportunistic senators began to covertly coordinate with the militant leaders of the Demes. They provided the mob with weapons, tactical direction, and, crucially, political legitimacy. What had begun as a localized protest over a botched execution was now a highly organized, heavily armed insurrection, steered by the highest echelons of Roman nobility who wished to restore the traditional balance of power by severing Justinian from the throne. For 5 days, Constantinople was effectively paralyzed. The central government ceased to function. The streets belonged to the unified factions, and the glow of the burning capital illuminated the night sky for miles across the Bosporus. The Great Palace, usually the unassailable nerve center of the Roman world, was reduced to a besieged bunker, completely cut off from the provinces and the regular army. On January 18th, 532 CE, the political insurrection reached its definitive climax. Inside the massive confines of the Hippodrome, the unified Demes, strictly coordinated by the resentful senatorial elite, elevated a reluctant new sovereign. They crowned Hypatius, the nephew of a former emperor, explicitly declaring the birth of a rival regime. The sheer mass of the crowd, numbering well over 50,000 armed and enraged citizens, had transformed the chariot arena from a sports venue into a fortified political stronghold. From the sealed corridors of the Great Palace, the imperial court could physically feel the reverberations of the new emperor's name being chanted, a rhythmic pressure that signaled the absolute evaporation of Justinian's authority. Inside the heavily guarded council chambers, Emperor Justinian confronted the total collapse of his administration. Surrounded by his most trusted military officers, including the brilliant General Belisarius and the seasoned Commander General Mundus, the emperor rationally analyzed his tactical position. The regular troops garrisoned within the capital were not only vastly outnumbered, but their loyalty was fracturing under the overwhelming scale of the citizen mob. Calculating that the defenses of the Great Palace would inevitably be breached by the fires and the sheer weight of numbers, Justinian's inner circle recommended an immediate strategic withdrawal. The order was given, and the immense wealth of the imperial treasury was systematically transported through subterranean passages and loaded onto royal galleys waiting in the private harbor. The imperial plan was entirely pragmatic, grounded in military survival rather than emotion. The objective was to abandon the burning capital by sea, safely navigate to the loyal eastern provinces, and eventually return with a hardened field army to reclaim the city. It was precisely at this moment of calculated retreat, as the court prepared to surrender the center of the world, that Empress Theodora intervened and permanently altered the trajectory of the Roman Empire. Theodora possessed a political intellect that matched the ruthlessness of the street she had risen from. She understood a fundamental, brutal law of Roman autocracy that the general's tactical maps had failed to capture. An emperor who voluntarily abandons his capital instantly ceases to be an emperor. She recognized that fleeing Constantinople would grant Hypatius and the Senate uncontested legitimacy. It would hand them the administrative apparatus, the remaining treasury, and the symbolic power of the city, effectively reducing Justinian from a sovereign to a mere fugitive. Addressing the panicked, high-ranking men of the council, Theodora dismantled their logic of retreat with cold, unyielding resolve. She acknowledged that the ships were fully supplied and the sea routes were open, offering an immediate guarantee of physical safety. However, she argued that survival stripped of absolute power was an intolerable degradation. She flatly refused to drop the title of Empress, issuing the famous declaration that purple makes a fine shroud. This was not a desperate plea. It was a masterclass in political realism. She forced the emperor and his supreme commanders to recognize that a deposed ruler has no future, no sanctuary, and no allies left to rally. Her absolute commitment to imperial dignity abruptly halted the evacuation. Shamed by the empress's total disregard for personal safety in the name of power, Justinian discarded the maritime escape route and decisively pivoted from a retreating survivor back to an autocratic sovereign. Flight was no longer an option. If they were to die, they would die as rulers, but first, they would unleash their generals. The absolute silence that followed Empress Theodora's declaration marked the death of the political crisis and the birth of a military operation. Emperor Justinian, abandoning any further thought of maritime escape, turned immediately to his supreme commanders. He granted General Belisarius and General Mundus sweeping authority to pacify the capital by any tactical means necessary. The generals swiftly assessed their available assets. The regular city garrisons were unreliable, deeply compromised by their ties to the local populace and the Demes. Instead, Belisarius and Mundus mobilized their personal retinues and the deeply loyal foreign contingents, battle-hardened Gothic troops, and fierce Herulian mercenaries. These men possessed no political affiliations within Constantinople, felt no sympathy for the urban poor, and viewed the Roman citizens outside the palace walls simply as enemy combatants. Belisarius initially attempted a surgical decapitation of the rebellion. Leading a detachment of elite imperial infantry, he navigated the smoldering ruins of the palace complex to reach the rear entrances of the Kathisma. His objective was to breach the imperial box, arrest the newly crowned Hypatius, and present the captured figurehead to the mob, instantly dissolving their political legitimacy. However, upon reaching the heavy wooden doors of the Kathisma, the general found them barred from the inside. The executors, the elite palace guard stationed within the structure, had chosen to remain strictly neutral, waiting to see which emperor would survive the day before committing their loyalty. Staring at the impenetrable doors, Belisarius realized that a bloodless political resolution was now physically impossible. Denied access to the Kathisma, Belisarius retreated to confer with Mundus, and the two commanders fundamentally redefined the battle space. They shifted their focus from the palace corridors to the massive architecture of the Hippodrome itself. The stadium was a colossal U-shaped structure, over 400 meters long, defined by towering tiers of marble seating and vast exterior walls designed to funnel crowds through specific, heavily fortified arches. For 5 days, the Demes had used the arena as a sanctuary and a staging ground. But as the generals studied the layout, they recognized a fatal tactical flaw in the mob's positioning. The rioters believed they were occupying a fortress to crown a sovereign. In reality, they had voluntarily concentrated the entirety of the empire's internal opposition into a single, walled enclosure with limited exits. The command decision was swift and absolute. The operation would transition from an arrest to an annihilation. Belisarius and Mundus divided their heavy infantry to execute a synchronized double envelopment. Belisarius marched his Gothic troops toward the northern end of the arena, advancing directly on the main entrances, ominously known as the Gates of Death. Simultaneously, General Mundus navigated his Herulian mercenaries through the ruined streets to the opposite side, securing the southeastern gate near the curved end of the track, the Sphenden. The regular troops moved with disciplined precision, forming dense shield walls as they approached the colossal archways, their heavy synchronized bootfalls vibrating against the ash-covered pavement. The trap was perfectly set. The mob had spent a week dismantling the administrative machinery of the Roman state, completely unaware that the military machinery was now aligning against them. Inside, tens of thousands of citizens were cheering for their newly crowned emperor. Outside, the heavy infantry locked the bronze gates. The assault began simultaneously at both ends of the colossal arena. At the northern perimeter, Belisarius ordered his Gothic veterans to breach the main entrances, driving their heavy shields into the dense, disorganized mass of rioters blocking the archways. To the south, General Mundus and his Herulian mercenaries flooded through the gates near the Sphendone, effectively severing the only remaining avenue of retreat. The Hippodrome, celebrated for centuries as a marvel of Roman engineering, designed to safely funnel 100,000 cheering spectators, instantly transformed into a massive, inescapable kill zone. The towering marble tiers, which had previously amplified the unified political voice of the Demes, now served only as high walls retaining a trapped population. The ensuing engagement was not a battle. It was a methodical execution, dictated by a severe tactical imbalance. The unified mob possessed overwhelming numbers and the fervent momentum of a week-long insurrection. But they were largely civilians, equipped with daggers, scavenged clubs, and improvised projectiles. Against them stood the premier heavy infantry of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Gothic and Herulian mercenaries wore iron mail, carried large oval shields, and wielded the spatha, the long heavy Roman broadsword designed for brutal efficiency in close quarters combat. As the Imperial vanguard locked their shields and advanced, the stark reality of regular warfare collided with the illusion of civilian power. The sudden metallic ring of thousands of drawn swords echoing off the stone seating completely shattered the triumphant chants of the newly crowned regime. Belisarius maintained absolute discipline among his ranks, forbidding his men from breaking formation to pursue fleeing individuals. Instead, the infantry lines operated like a relentless hydraulic press. They moved forward at a synchronized, measured pace, utilizing the sheer weight of their armored columns to compress the crowd toward the center of the sand track. Panic achieved what the Imperial blades could not immediately reach. As the two military contingents closed the distance from the north and south, the immense pressure of a panicked human surge caused thousands of citizens to be trampled or suffocated beneath the crushing weight of their own retreating factions. For several continuous hours, the professional soldiers dismantled the rebellion with industrial efficiency. There was no negotiation, no quarter given, and no distinction made between the armed gang leaders of the Blues and Greens or the impoverished citizens who had merely followed the crowd. The Imperial mercenaries, alienated from the cultural fabric of Constantinople and fiercely loyal only to their commanders and their pay, executed their orders without hesitation. By the time the forward ranks of Belisarius and Mundus finally met in the center of the arena, the unified political opposition of the capital had been entirely eradicated. The casualty figures were unprecedented for an internal urban suppression, with military accounts recording the deaths of approximately 30,000 Roman citizens in a single afternoon. With the mob effectively annihilated, the military objective shifted back to the political decapitation of the rival court. Belisarius directed a detachment of his guard to secure the Kathisma. They easily breached the Imperial box, bypassing the now irrelevant excubators, and seized Hypatius along with his brother Pompeius. The men who had been hailed as the new sovereigns of the Roman world just hours prior were dragged from the stands, stripped of their purple vestments, and marched across the blood-soaked sand to face the judgment of the true emperor waiting inside the great palace. The morning after the slaughter, the imperial administration moved swiftly to convert the military victory into permanent political supremacy. Hypatius and his brother Pompeius, the reluctant figureheads of the rebellion, were brought before Emperor Justinian. While historical accounts suggest Justinian briefly considered clemency, he ultimately bowed to the ruthless pragmatism of his council. On January 19, 532 CE, both men were executed, and their bodies were unceremoniously cast into the waters of the Bosporus. The purge then extended to the ancient aristocracy. Justinian ordered the immediate exile of every senator who had allied with the mob, confiscating their vast ancestral estates. In a single bureaucratic stroke, the emperor eradicated his political rivals and transferred immense unchecked wealth directly into the imperial treasury. With the Senate broken and the factions neutralized, Justinian surveyed a capital reduced largely to smoldering ash. Yet, where the populace saw a ruined metropolis, the emperor recognized an unprecedented architectural blank slate. he initiated a massive reconstruction campaign designed to permanently imprint his absolute authority onto the skyline of Constantinople. The centerpiece of this effort was the new Hagia Sophia. Rebuilt on the scorched foundations of the church destroyed by the rioters, the new structure was engineered on a scale previously thought impossible. When completed, its colossal dome did not merely serve as a place of worship. It stood as an intimidating, physical manifestation of Justinian's divine right to rule, designed to overwhelm the senses and demand total submission from anyone standing beneath its massive arches. The paramilitary power of the Demes was permanently broken. The Hippodrome remained closed for years, and when chariot racing was eventually permitted to resume, the Blues and the Greens had been violently stripped of their political teeth. They were reduced to exactly what the central government had always wanted them to be: mere sporting factions. They never again possessed the organizational capacity or the militant manpower to challenge the throne. The terrified populace of the capital, having witnessed the discipline deficiency of the regular army deployed against them, accepted a newly forged social contract where civic voice was entirely replaced by autocratic decree. The Nika Riots represent a horrifying yet undeniably effective pivot in European history. By authorizing the extermination of his own people, Justinian secured the unassailable domestic stability required to execute his grandest ambitions. The confiscated wealth of the exiled senators funded General Belisarius's massive military campaigns to reconquer North Africa and Italy from the Germanic tribes. The silenced domestic opposition allowed his magistrates to finalize the Justinian Code, establishing the legal foundation that would influence Western Europe for centuries. The enduring legacy of Justinian's reign, his grandest architecture, his sweeping reconquests, and his monumental legal framework, was ultimately built, funded, and secured upon the ashes of 30,000 Roman citizens. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.